Olds-Didsbury-Three Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to add my comments to the debate over Bill 12, the Fiscal Management Act. Like many of my colleagues here, I want to take a minute just to explain how I arrived here. I have 35 years of business experience. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a lawyer. But I have 35 years of successful business experience. I know how to read it. Thank you. I know how to read a financial statement. But I have to say that this budget is the most confusing document I've ever tried to absorb. So like my colleagues, I'm going to explain why I'm here. I have, in addition to 35 years of business experience, I have 11 years of municipal politics experience. 11 years on council, 8 years of those as mayor. We did budgets each and every one of those years. I had no trouble understanding them. But I do have some serious concerns about this piece of legislation, as do many of my constituents, and as do many Albertans all across the province. Last week, the government released its back-in-debt budget. Now, here we are debating a piece of legislation that will make the government's new, questionable accounting system the law. Bill 12 would repeal the Government Accountability Act and the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and I find that rather odd. This government brought in a brand new ministry this year: accountability, and transparency. And
he doesn't know either.
So I find it odd now that we're doing away with accountability and fiscal responsibility. Let me repeat that. It will repeal the Government Accountability Act and the Fiscal Responsibility Act. In effect, the government is removing accountability and responsibility in this legislation. What would repealing these pieces of legislation mean? It would remove the strict rules around debt that we have in Alberta. We need to remember that these are some of the same rules that made it possible to become a debt-free province in 2004. Now the government wants to remove these rules in order to move ahead with their borrowing plans that will see the province accumulate nearly $17 billion worth of debt by the 2016 election. This legislation would also allow the government to limit the interest payments on the debt to 3% of the average revenue for the fiscal year and the previous 2 fiscal years. In other words, the government has no real plan to get out of debt. We estimate that because of the actions this government is taking, it could be 2097 before Alberta is once again debt-free. And that, when I read that and I put this together, I'm thinking, over the holidays, my wife and I took a trip to Phoenix and to Dallas to visit with our grandkids over Christmas holidays. About the middle of January, I get my visa bill. And it was pretty substantial. And I happened to notice just underneath the balance, and it said if you make the minimum payment on this Visa card, it will take you 43 years to pay that off. And that's what we have here. So I said to my wife, why would we bother paying it off? We're going to be dead in 43 years. So, well, makes sense to me. I told you I wasn't an accountant. So. Bill 12 also makes changes to the Heritage Fund Act, and we would remove the requirement that the Legislative Committee on the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund review and approve the annual business plan for the Heritage Fund. In fact, if Bill 12 passes, the Heritage Fund won't even be required to have an annual business plan. Does removing the ability for a committee of the Legislature, made up of members from all parties, to review the plans for a Heritage Fund sound like the actions of a transparent and accountable government? Albertans sure don't think so, Mr. Speaker. Bill 12 will remove capital spending from the government's bottom line. Again, that is not a measure that will allow Albertans to hold the government to account, because it will make it much tougher for Albertans to see what the government's real bottom line is. Along those same lines, Bill 12 will drop the reporting requirement for non-operating numbers that are important to a budget. The total revenue and borrowing details. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2013, and by extension Bill 12, is committing Alberta to a $17 billion debt load by 2016 and reducing our savings fund to almost nothing. The current budget is a result of this PC government doubling the size of the entire provincial budget in the last 10 years because of their chronic overspending year after year. Bill 12 is a clear indication that the government has learned nothing and are still unable to budget responsibly. Instead, they plan to change the rules of a budget reporting and what constitutes a deficit in order to continue on with their wasteful spending habits, but at the same time try to make the numbers look better than they actually are. That is why my colleagues and I in the Wild Rose official opposition put forward the Financial Recovery Plan. Our plan would restore the Alberta Advantage and eliminate the provincial deficit in 2 years. We would prevent any new or tax increase from being introduced without a provincial referendum. Period. We have always been upfront about this with Albertans. Unlike the Premier, who still refuses to make a commitment on no tax hikes before the next election. No tax hikes this year, but no guarantee that they won't come before the next election. Our plan would implement 25 cost-saving recommendations focused on cutting wasteful spending, targeting government bureaucracy, and AHS waste, while at the same time protecting frontline services. I won't go into further details because the members opposite can read all the details of our plan for themselves. And to be honest, I spent so much time trying to figure out your budget, I haven't had time to absorb ours. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I would like to reiterate that Albertans did not ask for a return to debt. They asked for bold leadership with the moral fortitude to pay our bills, stay out of debt, and provide the high quality of services that Albertans deserve. We in the Wild Rose will continue to stand up for Albertans, and I ask that the government finally start to do the same.